She arrived with a small suitcase, a letter of engagement, and the belief that her life was about to change. But the man waiting for her on the platform wasn't who she thought he was. He looked her up and down, then sneered in front of the whole town. "I ordered a wife, not a scarecrow." That night, it snowed. The temperature was minus 20 degrees, and Clara Whitmore stood alone on the freezing platform, penniless, homeless, alone. This is the story of a woman left to die, and how she became something no one could destroy. If you enjoy stories of true strength, hit like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because the best part is yet to begin. Peyor. The train pulled into Harlan Creek just before 4 in the afternoon, and already the sky had turned the color of a bad bruise. That particular shade of gray-purple that people who'd spent winters in Montana knew meant serious weather was coming. Clara Whitmore pressed her face against the window glass and watched the town materialize out of the emptiness. A feed store, a livery, a handful of clapboard buildings hunched against the wind like men with bad backs. A water tower with the words Harlan Creek painted in fading white. Maybe 60 yards of Main Street before the land just opened up again into nothing. She'd been on trains for 4 days. She pulled back from the glass and smoothed her coat. Dark green wool, the best thing she owned, bought secondhand from a church sale in St. Louis 2 years ago and mended twice since then. She checked her hair in the small mirror she kept in her bag. Dark, a little limp from the travel, pinned back in the style she'd practiced for 3 mornings before leaving. She looked tired. She knew she looked tired. She told herself it didn't matter. His name was Edmund Graves. He was 34, a merchant, owned a dry goods store in Harlan Creek. He'd written to the placement agency in Chicago 6 weeks ago, and the agency had matched her to him based on her letter. She'd described herself as industrious, adaptable, experienced in household management, in good health. She had not described herself as beautiful, because she wasn't, particularly. She had what her aunt used to call a sensible face, which Clara had always understood to mean the kind of face nobody wrote poems about. But she'd thought, or maybe hoped, that at 23, coming to a frontier town where women were scarce, sensible would be enough. She gathered her bag in her single trunk and made her way to the door as the train slowed. The platform was crowded for such a small town. She counted maybe 20 people, which suggested that the arrival of a mail-order bride was entertainment enough to bring people out in December. She scanned the faces. Most of them were looking at her already. She spotted Edmund Graves immediately. He was standing toward the front of the small crowd, arms crossed over his chest, and she recognized him from the photograph he'd sent. A formal portrait, stiff-backed, serious expression, fair hair going thin at the temples. He was taller than she'd imagined, and his coat was good quality. He looked, she thought, like a man who ran a careful business and kept careful accounts. Clara stepped down from the train platform steps, her trunk bumping behind her, and walked toward him. The crowd shifted to let her through, and she was aware, sharply, uncomfortably aware, of how many eyes were on her. She kept her chin level. She extended her hand. "Mr. Graves," she said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. It's a pleasure to meet you." He didn't take her hand. He looked at her, not quickly, not the way a person glances at someone they're greeting. He looked at her the way a man examines merchandise he's considering returning. He started at her face, moved to her frame, her coat, her boots. He took his time about it. The crowd had gone very quiet. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "I beg your pardon? Your letter said you were in good health." His voice was flat, not angry exactly, more like a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying. "You look like a strong wind would knock you over." Clara felt her face go hot. She kept her hand steady. "I assure you, Mr. Graves, I'm quite healthy." The journey was long and plain, he said. She stopped. "Pardon me?" "I said you're plain." He said it the way someone states a fact about the weather. Not cruelly, not with malice, just with the casual authority of a man who believes his assessments are always accurate and always worth voicing. The agency didn't mention that. I'd have thought they'd mention something like that. Someone in the crowd coughed. Someone else made a sound that was either a laugh suppressed or something caught in a throat. Clara Whitmore stood on that platform with 20 people watching her and felt something happen in her chest. A kind of internal collapse, brief and total, like a floor giving way. And then, almost immediately, something else. A cold, hard thing that she would later recognize as the beginning of a different kind of woman than she'd been 4 days ago. "Mr. Graves," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out. "I traveled 4 days on that train. I gave up my position in Chicago, packed everything I own into one trunk, and came to Montana in December on the strength of your word. I expect that deserves at least a— I'm not going to marry you," he said. Just like that. 4 days, 200 miles, her whole hand of cards laid on the table, and he folded the game. "I went into this expecting a woman who could be a proper partner, a helpmeet, someone who could—" He gestured vaguely at her, at all of her, as if the gesture completed the sentence. "I don't think you're what I need." Clara's mouth had gone dry. She was aware of every face turned toward her. She was aware of the cold coming up through the soles of her boots. She was aware that her trunk was sitting on the ground beside her, and that she had $11.40 in the inside pocket of her coat, and that the next eastbound train wasn't until morning, and that it was December in Montana, and that the sky behind the water tower was going darker by the minute. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, and she hated how small the question sounded. She hated that she'd asked it at all. But there was nowhere to put pride when the alternative was freezing. Graves looked briefly uncomfortable, which was the most human thing he'd done in 5 minutes. "There's a hotel. I'll pay for one night." He reached into his coat and produced a few bills, held them out toward her. She did not take them. She couldn't explain why, later. $11 wasn't enough to get her back to Chicago. One night in a hotel didn't solve anything. The money would have been practical, sensible, the smart thing to accept. But something in her, that cold, hard thing, would not let her hand reach out for it. "Keep your money, Mr. Graves," she said. She picked up her trunk herself, turned away from him, and walked to the far end of the platform. Behind her, she heard him say something she didn't catch, heard a few voices, heard the crowd begin to disperse back into the warmth of their lives. She set her trunk down against the station wall and sat on it and looked out at the main street of Harlan Creek, Montana, in December, as the last gray light bled out of the sky. She had nowhere to go. She knew nobody. She had $11. She was, she thought, in genuine trouble. The station master was a heavy-set man named Pell, who wore a knitted cap and smelled of pipe tobacco, and he told her, not unkindly, that he locked up the station at 6 and that he couldn't allow her to stay inside overnight. Company policy. He looked sorry about it, actually, more sorry than Graves had looked, and he said there was a boarding house 2 blocks up, run by a widow named Hartfield, that might have a room. Clara thanked him and asked if the hotel was reputable. Pell looked at her carefully, the way people looked at women who were asking questions that had more underneath them than the words themselves. "Hartfield's is better," he said, and that told her most of what she needed to know about the hotel. She tried the boarding house first. Mrs. Hartfield was a narrow-faced woman who opened the door about 6 inches and looked at Clara the way a person assesses a stray dog. Not unkindly, but with the clear understanding that accepting one stray tends to lead to more. "I heard about the business at the station," Mrs. Hartfield said. Small towns. Of course she'd heard. Of course the news had arrived before Clara had. "I don't rent to single women without employment." "I'm looking for work." "Then come back when you've found some." The door closed. Clara stood on the porch for a moment, then she walked back out into the street. It was fully dark now. The temperature had dropped hard in the last hour, the way it did in high country in December, not a gradual descent but a sudden one, like stepping off a ledge. Her coat was good wool, but it wasn't Montana wool, and the wind coming down the main street had teeth in it. She could see her breath in thick clouds. Her fingers inside her gloves were already losing feeling at the tips. She stood outside the Mercantile across from the station and tried to think. She had $11, a trunk with her belongings. No contacts in this territory, no family within 1,000 miles. Her aunt, the last of her people, had died the previous March, and that loss was still fresh enough that thinking about it directly felt like probing a broken tooth. She could try the hotel, whatever its reputation. She could sleep in the station before Pell locked up, until he made her leave. She could— "You plan on standing there till you freeze, or you got something else in mind?" The voice came from her left. 2 men she hadn't noticed, leaning against the wall of the Mercantile about 10 feet away. One was older, maybe 40, with a scraggly beard and a coat that had seen better decades. The other was younger, somewhere around 20, with a smile that came too easy and stayed too long. "I'm fine," Clara said. "Don't look fine," the older one said. "Look lost." "I'm not lost." "You're standing in the cold and the dark in a town you don't know without anybody," the younger one said. "That's pretty much the definition of lost, ma'am." He said ma'am with an emphasis that made it sound like an insult. Clara gripped the handle of her trunk and took a step back. "I'm waiting for someone." "No, you ain't," the older man said. He pushed off the wall, not rushing, just moving. "We heard what happened at the station. Graves turned you out." He tilted his head, studying her. "That leaves you in a real uncomfortable spot, don't it?" "I'd like you to leave me alone." "Well, we'd like to help." He smiled. "It's cold. We know a place you could get warm, get something to eat, get comfortable." She understood exactly what kind of place he was describing. She'd understood it from the first word out of his mouth. "No thank you," she said. "Awful proud for somebody standing on a train platform without a cent to her name." "I have sense," she said, which was true, but not the point. The younger man laughed. The older one took another step toward her, and she looked around the platform. There were still people visible through the windows of the buildings across the street, warm and lit, and none of them were looking out here. None of them were going to look out here. She'd learned that already today. Harlan Creek was a town that could watch a woman get humiliated on a train platform and then go home to dinner. She tightened her grip on her trunk and tried to think about what to do. And she was still thinking when she heard boots on the station platform behind her. "You two lost something?" The voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't gentle. The kind that's been emptied of everything that could distract from the words themselves. Clara turned. The man standing at the edge of the platform was somewhere in his mid-30s, she'd have guessed. Tall, but not the kind of tall that announces itself. He was the kind of tall you notice after the fact because he just seems to take up more space than expected. His coat was dark canvas, worn and practical. He had a hat pulled down against the wind, and beneath it his face was weathered in the particular way of men who worked outside in all seasons. Not lined exactly, but settled, like wood that's been through enough cycles of weather to stop moving. What Clara noticed first was that he was carrying a child. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, asleep against his left shoulder with her head tucked under his chin, her dark hair spilling over his coat collar. The man had one arm around her and his other hand was loose at his side, and he stood on that platform looking at the two men with an expression that wasn't threatening exactly. It was something quieter and more unsettling than threatening. It was the expression of a man who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. The older man straightened. He and the newcomer looked at each other for a moment. That specific kind of looking that men do when they're assessing a situation, and then the older man picked something up in whatever he saw, because his posture changed. "Just having a conversation," the older man said. "Doesn't look that way," the newcomer said. "Time to move on." It wasn't a request. It wasn't particularly angry, either. It was just a statement that carried in it the absolute certainty that the conversation was finished. The two men looked at each other. Then they moved, not hurrying, not rushing, too proud for that, but they moved. Within a minute, they'd disappeared around the corner of the feed store and the street was quiet again. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The man looked at her. The little girl shifted against his shoulder but didn't wake. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. It was slightly more true than it had been 2 minutes ago. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" She'd been asked that question before tonight, and she was going to be asked it again, probably, and she still didn't have a good answer for it. "I'm working on it." He glanced at her trunk. He glanced at the darkness past the end of the platform. His expression didn't change much, but something moved behind his eyes, some calculation being made. "I've got a ranch about 8 miles out," he said. "My housekeeper left in October. The spare room's empty. Nothing improper," he added quickly, in the tone of a man who knows how things can be misread and is preempting it. "My daughter's there. You'd have your own room with a lock. I'd ask you to help with the house while you decide what you're doing next. That's all I'm offering." Clara looked at him. She looked at the sleeping child on his shoulder. She looked at the sky, which had now gone fully black and was beginning to show what was either stars or the first fine flakes of something she didn't want to think about. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. I don't know anything about you. No, he said again. My name's Rhett Callahan. I've ranched outside Harlan Creek for 11 years. My wife died 3 years ago. That's my daughter Maisie. You can ask anybody in town if you want references. Pell at the station will vouch for me. So will Doc Heller on 2nd Street. Take your time. I have approximately 4 minutes before my fingers stop working, Clara said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like a smile's first cousin, arriving late and not staying long. Then maybe ask fast, he said. The wagon was a working vehicle in every sense. Hay on the bed, tools bundled and tied in one corner, a smell of horses and hard use that was not unpleasant exactly, just honest. Rhett Callahan lifted her trunk into the back with one hand while keeping Maisie balanced against the other shoulder, without apparently noticing the effort involved. Clara climbed up onto the bench herself before he could offer to help, which she did partly out of habit and partly because she was still deciding what kind of person she was going to be here. Needing help was one thing. Starting from help before she'd tried was something else. They drove in silence for the first few minutes, out of Harlan Creek and onto a road that was more of a direction than a road. Packed earth and 2 worn tracks through scrub grass, heading north with the mountains visible as a black outline against the sky. The temperature was dropping steadily. Clara tucked her hands inside her coat and watched the land open up around them, flat and enormous and indifferent, and tried to think practically instead of letting herself feel the full weight of the day. Maisie slept between them on the bench, curled against her father's side, one small fist wrapped in his coat lapel. How long have you been ranching out here? Clara asked eventually. Not because she was particularly interested right now, but because silence felt like something she needed to fill. Since I was 22, Rhett said. Bought 40 acres with a partner. Partner left. Bought him out. He paused. It's 200 acres now. That's a lot of land for one man. I've got 2 hands. Burl and Ames. They live in the bunkhouse. And no housekeeper since October. No. What happened to the housekeeper? He was quiet a moment. She didn't like the winters. He said it without inflection, which Clara thought might mean there was more to the story, or might just mean there was nothing else to say. What made you offer me the room? She asked. He looked at the road ahead. Maisie made a small sound in her sleep and pressed closer to him. She would have done the same, he said. He didn't specify who she was. Clara didn't ask. She looked out at this dark land. She thought about Edmund Graves and his careful assessment of her adequacy, and his handful of offered bills, and the particular flavor of his dismissal, the way he'd done it in front of everyone, as if her humiliation was a small administrative inconvenience he'd rather have witnesses for. She thought about the 2 men at the station and the way the older one had known, with the certainty of long practice, that a woman standing alone in the cold without anywhere to go was a problem a certain type of man could solve to his own advantage. She thought about the way Rhett Callahan had stood on that platform with a sleeping child against his shoulder and told 2 men to move on, and the way they'd done it. You have a lot of cattle? She asked. Decent herd, about 300 head going into winter, fewer coming out usually. What do you lose them to? He glanced at her sideways like the question had surprised him slightly. Weather, sickness sometimes, wolves occasionally, though not as bad as some years. He looked back at the road. You know something about ranching? Nothing, Clara said, but I figure if I'm going to be staying on a ranch, even temporarily, it's useful to understand what the work is. Another of those almost smiles. This one stayed a fraction of a second longer. Fair enough, he said. The ranch house was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something grim, maybe, given the circumstances. A widower alone with a young daughter, a housekeeper who'd quit, 8 miles of frozen road from the nearest town. She'd prepared herself for something that confirmed the difficulty of it. Instead, she found a house that was clearly trying, not succeeding entirely, not without help, but trying. The main room had a stone fireplace along one wall that was going to be beautiful in another 10 years when the stone had fully darkened. There were curtains, real curtains, cotton with a faded stripe, on the windows, and they were crooked, hung by someone who hadn't put curtains up before and had done their best. On the mantel, there were 3 small objects: a tin cup, a carved wooden bird painted badly in green and red, and a small photograph in a frame. The photograph was a woman's face, formal pose, dark-eyed. Clara looked at it for just a moment and then looked away. The kitchen was functional and reasonably clean, with the particular cleanliness of a man who tidies because disorder frustrates him, not because he's naturally organized. The woodpile by the back door was serious, stacked high and deep, the work of someone who understood Montana winters, even if he didn't like them. Rhett set Maisie down on the settee and lit the lamp on the table. In the proper light, Clara could see the child more clearly. She had her father's coloring, dark hair, darker eyes, but her face was rounded and soft with early childhood in a way that made her look like a completely different species from the weathered man standing over her. She had dried tear tracks on one cheek, old ones, not fresh. Rhett pulled a quilt over her without waking her. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "Spare room's off the kitchen. There's a bolt on the inside of the door." He said it straightforwardly, without making it awkward, which Clara appreciated. "Outhouse is around back. I'll have Burl bring in extra wood in the morning. You'll want to keep the room fire going through the night." "I'll manage," Clara said. "There's soup on the stove. It's been there since noon, so it's reduced some, but it's edible." He paused. "You should eat something." She realized, starving. She hadn't eaten since a biscuit in Billings at 7 that morning. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He picked up the lamp and she thought he was going to take it, but instead he set it on the kitchen table and went to get another one from the shelf above the fireplace. The small domestic logic of it, she needed light more than he did right now, was done without comment, which was somehow more decent than if he'd mentioned it. "What time does Maisie wake?" Clara asked. He paused at the door to the back of the house. 6, usually, sometimes 5. He stopped, tried again. "She's been having trouble sleeping through since November. You don't need to worry about her, I'll handle it." Clara nodded. She heated the soup, which turned out to be better than edible, some kind of beef and root vegetable thing, thick with having cooked down, with a flavor that suggested the cook had once known what he was doing, even if he'd gotten out of practice. She ate at the kitchen table in silence and listened to the wind outside picking up. The window over the sink had a gap at the top corner of the frame where cold air came through and rattled the pane. She'd fix that tomorrow, she thought. She'd seen the rag pile by the back door. A bit of twisted rag stuffed into that gap would stop the draft. She ate the soup, and then she sat for a while and let herself feel, just briefly, the full weight of the day. The train platform. Graves's flat voice, too plain, too fragile. The crowd watching, the men in the dark. The cold. Then she put that down. She washed the bowl and the spoon. She found her way to the spare room and found that it was small but adequate. A narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall for coats, a small iron stove that she got going with wood from the box beside it. She bolted the door. She lay on the bed in her clothes, because it wasn't warm enough yet to undress, and listened to the wind. She thought, this is not a solution. This is one night, one man's charity. Tomorrow you have to think about what comes next. She thought, $11 won't get me back to Chicago. Not enough for a boarding house until I find work. Not enough for... She stopped. She was doing the thing she always did when she was frightened, which was count obstacles, until she ran out of space and then start again. She'd never found it useful, and she never managed to stop doing it. She made herself think about the curtains in the main room instead. Crooked, hung by someone who'd done their best. The quilt pulled over the little girl. The soup that had been on the stove since noon, which meant someone had made it that morning with the intention of there being something to eat in the evening, which meant some kind of structure still existed here, even if it was fraying at the edges. She would be useful, she decided. Whatever happened next, whatever she decided about where she was going and how she was getting there, she would earn the room she was in by being useful. She was not going to be someone's charity case. She didn't know exactly what skills she had that translated to a Montana cattle ranch, but she had learned things in her 23 years. She could cook, she could clean, she could learn. She had learned harder things than this. The fire in the small stove began to warm the room. Outside, the wind had settled into a steady, low tone, the kind that goes on all night. Clara Whitmore lay on the narrow bed in a stranger's house 8 miles from a town that already knew her as the woman who'd been rejected on the platform, and she stared at the ceiling and she thought about what she was going to do. She fell asleep still thinking about it, which was perhaps the most honest thing that happened to her all day. Tamam. She woke before 5. The room was cold. The stove had burned down and she'd neglected to bank it properly. A mistake she cataloged and stored away. And through the thin wall, she could hear movement in the kitchen. Small, light footsteps, a cabinet opening. Clara sat up, took her bearings, remembered where she was. She put on her coat over her clothes and unbolted the door. Maisie was in the kitchen. She was standing on a chair pulled up to the counter, and she was doing something with a tin cup that involved pouring water from a pitcher that was almost too heavy for her. The water went roughly where she was aiming it, with some spillage. She stopped when she saw Clara. She looked at her with dark, serious eyes and said nothing. "Good morning," Clara said. Maisie looked at her for a long moment. "Are you the new lady?" she asked. "I suppose I am," Clara said. "For now, anyway. My name's Clara." "Clara," Maisie said, trying the word. "My name's Maisie Ruth Callahan." "That's a fine name," Clara said. "All 3 of them." Maisie appeared to accept this. She went back to her water-pouring project. Clara came into the kitchen, assessed the stove, still warm from last night, coals banked properly in there, just needing wood, and began quietly building the fire back up. "What are you making?" she asked. "Water," Maisie said, with the gravity of someone explaining the obvious. "Water," Clara repeated. "Good plan. Papa makes coffee. I make water." She paused. "I am not allowed the coffee yet. Papa says I'm too small." "Your papa's probably right about that one." Maisie considered this with visible reluctance. "Maybe," she allowed. The fire caught. Clara added a larger piece of wood and adjusted the damper and looked at the kitchen in proper morning light. The window over the sink showed the gap clearly. She could see daylight through it at the corner, a thread of cold coming in. She found a rag in the pile and twisted it and pressed it into the gap. Not perfect, but better. She found flour. She found salt and lard. She found, in the back of the cabinet, a tin of dried apples that had been there long enough to develop opinions about their situation. She smelled them. Still all right. She found a pan. By the time she heard Rhett's boots on the back steps, she had biscuits in the oven, a pan of salt pork on the stove, and a pot of dried apple sauce beginning to simmer. He came through the back door with cold air and the smell of the barn. He stopped when he saw the kitchen. He looked at the stove. He looked at Clara at the counter. He looked at Maisie, who had finished her water project and was now sitting at the table watching Clara work with the focused attention of a small scientist observing a new phenomenon. He took off his hat. He didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. "I know," Clara said. "I was awake." He hung his hat on the hook by the door. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat at the table across from his daughter. "The window gap," he said. "Temporary fix. You need proper caulking, but the rag'll stop the draft for now." He looked at the window. He looked back at her. Something moved in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, more like a quiet surprise. The look of a man who'd calculated the difficulty of the morning and arrived in the kitchen to find the calculation wrong. "Biscuits in about 10 minutes, Clara said. "I didn't know if you took coffee strong or weak." "Strong," he said. "That's what I made." Maisie had been watching this exchange with great attention. "Papa," she said, "Clara fixed the cold window." "I see that," Rhett said. "And she is making applesauce," Maisie continued. "I see that too." "I think," Maisie said, in the considered tone of a child who has been doing analysis, "that Clara might be good." Neither adult said anything to that. But Clara, her back turned to them, rolling out the second batch of biscuits on the counter, pressed her lips together against something that was, embarrassingly, not far from tears. Not sad ones. Just the kind that come when you've been through a very long day and someone, even a small someone with dark eyes and a tin cup of water, says something unexpectedly kind. She finished the biscuits. She set the table. She sat with them and ate. And outside the wind was still blowing and the land was still enormous, and she still had $11 and no plan. But the kitchen was warm. The biscuits were good. And Maisie Callahan ate 2.5 of them with applesauce on top and then asked if she could have another. And Clara said yes. And the morning came in through the window, gray and cold and ordinary, and it was enough. It was, for right now, enough. The second morning was harder than the first. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving something difficult. The first night you ran on emergency reserves. on the animal need to simply get through it. And it was only afterward, when the crisis had passed and you were standing in someone else's kitchen in yesterday's clothes trying to remember what you were supposed to do next, that the weight of it actually arrived. Clara woke before 5 again, lay in the narrow bed listening to the wind, and felt the full arithmetic of her situation settle over her like a cold blanket. She had $11, she had a trunk of clothes and 2 books and a small box of her aunt's things. She hadn't been able to bring herself to go through. She had no contacts in Montana, no family anywhere, and a reputation in Harlan Creek that had been established in approximately 4 minutes on a train platform and would take considerably longer to undo, if it could be undone at all. She got up, she built the fire, she went to work. That was the thing she'd learned early, growing up in the kind of circumstances where options were limited and feelings were largely a private matter. When the situation was bad, you moved. Standing still let the bad thing get heavier. Moving didn't fix anything, but it kept you from being buried. So she moved. She found the state of the house in the morning light more clearly than she'd found it the night before. The main room was functional, but neglected in the particular way that happens when a capable person leaves a household and the remaining occupant is managing too many other things to fill the gap. The curtains she'd noticed the first night were crooked and also dusty. The rug in front of the fireplace had been turned to cover a worn spot, which meant the worn spot was now on the side where feet actually went. There was a window in the back room with a broken latch that had been temporarily fixed with a piece of rope tied to a nail, which worked but was the kind of solution that only held as long as nobody thought too hard about it. Clara didn't have caulking compound, or a proper latch, or most of what she'd need to fix things correctly. What she had was time and willingness, and she'd learned that those 2 things, applied consistently, could substitute for a surprising amount of resources. She started with what she could actually address. She restrung the curtains. The rod brackets were still solid. It was just the fabric that had slipped, and straightened them and discovered that straightened and shaken out of their dust, they looked considerably better, still faded but decent. She turned the rug back the correct direction and moved the settee 2 feet so its leg covered the worn spot in a way that was both honest and functional. She found a tin of oil in the kitchen and applied it to every hinge in the house that complained when moved, which was 4 of them, and the silence that followed was its own small satisfaction. Rhett came in from the morning barn work to find her on her knees, relining the kitchen shelves with old newspapers she'd found in a box near the back door. He stopped and looked at her. "You don't need to do all that," he said. "I know," Clara said, without looking up from her work. She was tearing the newspaper into strips with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned to get a lot of use out of whatever was available. "I'm doing it anyway." He was quiet a moment. "The newspaper's from April," he said, which wasn't a complaint, just an observation, as if he'd only just remembered the box existed. "Doesn't matter what it says," Claire said. "It keeps the shelves clean and gives the mice less to work with." Another pause. "We don't have mice." "Not yet," Clara said pleasantly. She heard something that might have been a short exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, and then his boots moved away toward the table where she'd left his coffee. The arrangement, such as it was, had not been formally discussed after that first morning. There had been no conversation about terms or duration or what exactly was being offered in exchange for what. Rhett had gone to his work, and Clara had done hers, and they had met at meals with Maisie between them like a small, energetic mediator. And that was the shape of things. It was uncomfortable in the way that all unspoken arrangements are uncomfortable, with the awareness of the conversation they weren't having sitting at the edges of every exchange. But neither of them initiated it, and the days moved forward. What Clara had not anticipated was how much she didn't know. She could cook. That much was true, or true enough. She could make the basic things, could follow the logic of a recipe even without having one written down, could work with limited ingredients and produce something edible, and occasionally something better than that. But cooking in a frontier kitchen in Montana in December was a different proposition than cooking in a Chicago boarding house with a proper iron range and access to a market 2 blocks away. The stove was a large and temperamental cast iron beast that ran hot on the left side and barely warm on the right, and required a particular configuration of dampers that took her 4 days to figure out, during which time she burned a pot of beans, undercooked a pan of cornbread to the point that it was dense as clay in the center, and boiled a stew so hard the bottom scorched and the whole thing had to be thrown out. The scorched stew was the worst of it. She stood at the stove and looked at the ruined pot and felt a particular kind of anger at herself. Not the dramatic kind, but the flat, practical anger of wasted resources. The beans, the onion, the piece of salt pork she'd stretched across 3 meals, all of it gone because she hadn't understood the damper. She cleaned the pot. She started again with what was left. She paid attention to the damper. She didn't tell Red about the stew. She didn't need to, because Burl mentioned it at dinner that night. Burl being one of the ranch hands, a short, bandy-legged man in his 50s, with a face that had been used hard and kind eyes behind it, who came to supper most evenings and treated the information sharing as a natural extension of conversation. "Smelled something scorched earlier," he said, not accusingly, just noting it, and Clara said she'd had trouble with the stove and was still learning it, and Burl nodded and said the left side ran hot if you didn't block the lower damper, which was information it would have been useful to have 4 days ago, but which she accepted without comment. "Thank you," she said. "I'll remember that." Burl looked at her with those kind eyes. "You're doing fine," he said, with the gentleness of a man who understood what it meant to be new somewhere and have everyone watching to see if you'd manage. "I burned a stew," Clara said. "I burned down a cook tent in the army," Burl said. "Tent and all. Everybody's still eating." She laughed at that, and it surprised her, the laugh, because it came before she'd thought about whether she wanted to laugh. She hadn't laughed in... She counted backward. She genuinely couldn't remember the last time before this. Maisie, sitting beside her, looked up at the sound with an expression of great interest, as if she'd been waiting to see what that would look like. The laundry was another education. She'd done laundry her whole life, in city boarding houses where the process involved a tub and a washboard and a managed inconvenience, not a process requiring hauling water from the pump in 30-degree cold, heating it on that same temperamental stove, wrestling shirts and work pants that weighed as much as small children when wet, and then hanging everything on a line outside where it froze solid within 20 minutes and had to be brought back in to finish drying by the fire. The first time she did it, the process took the entire day and left her with hands so chapped they cracked at the knuckles, and everything smelled faintly of wood smoke, which she learned eventually was just the smell of things that were clean in this particular place and there was no changing it. She cracked her knuckles on a Tuesday and stood at the washboard and thought, briefly and specifically, "I have never worked this hard in my life." It wasn't self-pity. It was more like acknowledgement, like marking a fact in a ledger. Then she kept washing. What she hadn't expected, what she hadn't had any framework to anticipate, was Maisie. Rhett's daughter was 4 years old, and she was an entire situation. She was not a difficult child in the way that word usually meant. She wasn't given to tantrums or destructiveness or deliberate cruelty in the way some children were. She was curious in the consuming way of children that age, and she was articulate for 4, and she had an opinion about absolutely everything, and she expressed those opinions with the confidence of someone who had not yet learned that opinions could be wrong. She also had been without consistent female company for long enough that Clara's presence in the house had the effect of a match in a room full of paper. The first week, Maisie followed her from room to room at a distance of approximately 4 feet, like a small satellite. She asked questions that ranged from sensible, "Why do you tear the newspaper into strips and not just leave it whole?" to philosophical, "If you had to be an animal, which one?" to deeply specific, "Have you ever broken a bone and did it hurt a lot or just a medium amount?" Clara answered them all, because ignoring them felt unkind, and the questions were, if she was being honest, often more interesting than what she'd been thinking about anyway. "My mama could make a pie crust so thin you could see through it," Maisie said one afternoon, standing beside Clara at the kitchen counter watching her attempt biscuits with more confidence than she'd had the first week. "Like paper, but not paper." "That's a real skill," Clara said. She was cutting the biscuits with a tin cup because there was no proper cutter. "Not everybody can do that." "Can you?" "I have no idea," Clara said honestly. "I've never tried. My aunt taught me pie crust, but it was more the regular kind." Maisie considered this. "Maybe you could learn," she said generously. "Maybe I could," Clara agreed. Maisie was quiet for a moment, watching the cup come down on the dough. "Do you miss your aunt?" Clara's hands didn't stop moving. "Yes," she said. "She died in March." "My mama died in December," Maisie said, 2 Decembers ago. She said it with the particular solemnity of young children discussing death, which is both more casual and more serious than adults manage. Papa gets quiet in December. That makes sense, Clara said. He gets quiet in March too, Maisie said, and sometimes August. I think he gets quiet whenever he remembers. She paused. I remember her, but not like a whole picture, more like pieces. Clara set down the tin cup. She looked at Maisie, who was looking back at her with those dark, clear eyes, and thought about what to say, and decided that the truth was better than something soft. Pieces are real too, she said. Pieces are worth keeping. Maisie thought about this seriously. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to watching the biscuits. That night, lying in her room, Clara thought about that conversation for a long time. About what it meant that a 4-year-old girl had already developed a theory of her father's grief, had mapped its seasons and knew its patterns. About what kind of loss it took to teach that to a child. About the photograph on the mantel with the dark eyes. She was not going to fall into the trap, she told herself, of romanticizing this situation. A widower and a motherless child in a hard place. That was a story that could very easily become something it shouldn't become, if you let it. She was here because she'd had nowhere else to go. She was useful here. That was all it needed to be. She kept telling herself that, with the particular firmness of someone who doesn't entirely trust themselves to believe it. The trouble with the town came in the 3rd week. She'd been into Harlan Creek twice by then, once with Rhett to the feed store for supplies, and once alone on an errand she'd managed by taking the small wagon herself, which had been an adventure given that her horse experience was limited and the horse had opinions. Both times she'd been aware of the watching, the careful, measuring quality of small-town attention, the way conversation shifted slightly when she came in, the way eyes tracked her across a room and then went back to other things when she looked up. She'd expected that. A strange woman living on a widower's ranch 2 weeks after being publicly rejected on the train platform was going to attract attention. That was simple human nature, and there was no point resenting it. What she hadn't expected was Mrs. Vera Colton. Mrs. Vera Colton was, by Clara's assessment, a woman who had made herself the keeper of Harlan Creek's social conscience through a combination of genuine community investment and the specific satisfaction of finding other people wanting. She was 50 or thereabouts, well-dressed by frontier standards, and she arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning with another woman Clara didn't know, and she didn't bother with much preamble. "Miss Whitmore," she said, standing in the doorway that Clara had opened to her knock. She looked past Clara into the house with the quick sweep of someone taking inventory. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," Clara said, which was not entirely true since she'd been in the middle of mending a tear in the curtain, but hospitality was hospitality. "Would you like to come in?" They came in. They sat in the main room. Clara made tea, which Harlan Creek seemed to drink more than she'd expected, and brought it out on the tray she'd found in the back of a cabinet, and cleaned up, and set it down and sat across from them. "We wanted to call," Mrs. Colton said, in the tone that means the official reason for visiting is about to make way for the real one, to make sure you were settling in all right. "I appreciate that," Clara said. "It's an unusual situation," Mrs. Colton said. "It is," Clara agreed. "Rhett Callahan is a well-respected man," Mrs. Colton continued. She was looking at Clara in the way people look at things they've already decided about, but are being polite in how they're deciding. "He's been through a great deal. He and his daughter both. The community takes a certain interest in his well-being." "That's kind of the community," Clara said. She kept her voice level and her hands around her teacup. "There are people who are concerned," Mrs. Colton said, "about the appearance of things." "What appearance is that?" Mrs. Colton looked briefly as though she'd hoped Clara would make this easier by understanding without being told. "An unmarried woman living on a man's property. It creates talk." "People are welcome to talk," Clara said. "What they say about me is their business." "What they say about him is also their business," Mrs. Colton said more sharply. "He has a reputation. He has a daughter." "I'm aware of that," Clara said. "I'm also aware that I arrived in this town with nowhere to go in below freezing temperatures, and that Mr. Callahan provided shelter with his daughter present, and a bolt on my door, and that the arrangement is a practical one with nothing improper about it." "That may be," the other woman said. She'd introduced herself as Mrs. Pryor, and she'd spoken very little until now. "But you must understand how it looks." I understand exactly how it looks," Clara said. I also understand that looking and being are two different things, and I know which one of those I can control. She set her cup down. I'm grateful for your visit, genuinely. But I'm not going to leave because people in town have formed opinions about my situation. That's not something I'm willing to do. The silence after that had a specific texture. Mrs. Colton looked at her, reassessing, and Clara held her gaze without aggression, but also without yielding. You're stubborn, Mrs. Colton said after a moment. When it's called for, Clara said. Mrs. Colton made a sound that was hard to categorize. Not quite a laugh, not quite disapproval, somewhere in between. And then she picked up her tea. They stayed another 20 minutes, and by the end of it, Mrs. Colton had told Clara that the Methodist Ladies Auxiliary met on the first Friday of the month if she was interested, which Clara understood to be both an olive branch and a continued monitoring mechanism. And she'd said she'd consider it, which was the truth. After they left, she sat in the main room for a while in the quiet. Then she went back to the curtain she'd been mending. Rhett heard about this visit that evening. Burl mentioned it at dinner, having heard from someone in town, because Harlan Creek's information network operated at a speed that was impressive given the absence of a telegraph dedicated to gossip. He looked at Clara across the table. You didn't have to stay, he said. Just that. Not asking what had been said, not defending himself or the situation, just acknowledging that she'd had a choice. I know, Clara said. It'll get worse before it gets better, he said. Probably, she agreed. Maisie, who had been eating with the focused attention she brought to anything involving food, looked up. What will get worse? The weather, Rhett said, without hesitation. And Maisie accepted this and went back to her dinner, and Clara pressed her lips together and looked at her plate and felt something loosen very slightly in the middle of her chest, the specific sensation of someone choosing your side without making a speech about it. The week settled into a shape that was, if not comfortable, then at least navigable. She learned the stove completely by the end of the second week. She learned that Maisie woke bad sometimes, not just early, but genuinely distressed, in the way children are when sleep has taken them somewhere frightening, and that the thing that helped was not rushing in to fix it, but sitting at the edge of the bed and talking quietly about ordinary things until the child's breathing came back to normal. She learned that Rhett took his coffee with 2 sugars in the morning and none in the afternoon, and that this was not a preference he'd mentioned, but one she'd observed and matched without comment, and which he'd noticed without acknowledging, though she could tell he'd noticed because he used the cup without checking it when she handed it to him, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She learned that the land in the early morning, before the cold settled fully in and when the light came sideways off the mountains, was the most purely beautiful thing she had ever seen. That wasn't something she'd expected. She'd expected to tolerate Montana. She hadn't expected to find it, in certain specific moments, genuinely astonishing. One morning in the 4th week, she was coming back from the outhouse in the dark before sunrise because there was nothing romantic about frontier life in that particular regard. And she looked up and the sky was so full of stars, properly full, the kind of full you can't see from a city. The kind where the sky isn't black with stars in it, but white-gray with stars so dense they press together, that she stopped on the path and stood there in 20-degree cold in her coat and looked at it for a full minute before going back inside. She didn't tell anyone about that. Some things belonged to herself. The incident with this firewood happened on a Monday in the middle of the 3rd week. There had been a misunderstanding about which pile was seasoned and which was green, and Clara had loaded green wood into the main room fireplace, which she'd known might be a problem theoretically, but had not fully understood would be a problem practically in the specific way it turned out to be, which was that green wood does not burn so much as smoke. She'd had the damper open correctly, but there was something else, a partial blockage in the chimney, a bird's nest from the previous summer that nobody had cleared, and instead of going up, the smoke had come sideways into the main room, in sufficient quantity to turn the air gray and set off a coughing fit in Maisie that brought Rhett in from outside at a run. He dealt with the chimney, climbed on the roof himself in freezing temperatures with a long pole while she stood below feeling like an idiot and holding the ladder. And he'd been patient about it, or at least he hadn't been impatient, but there was a particular set to his jaw that she recognized as a man holding his reaction at a distance until he could figure out the right size for it. The house smelled of smoke for 2 days. The curtains she'd straightened had to be rehung and beaten outside. I didn't know about the nest, she said that evening. I should have told you, he said. I should have checked the chimney in October. I didn't. I should have checked that the wood was seasoned. Yes, he said, which she appreciated more than if he'd said it wasn't her fault, because it was partly her fault and they both knew it, and being told otherwise would have felt like condescension. I'll know next time, she said. There's a lot of next times out here, Rhett said, not unkindly. The land's been teaching people next times for a long while. She looked at him. In the lamplight at the kitchen table, the weathered quality of his face was more visible. Not old, exactly, but used, in the way of something that has done its intended job for a long time and bears the marks of it. She thought about what Maisie had said about his quiet Decembers. This was December still, just barely. He was quiet, she realized, in the particular way she'd been learning to recognize. Present, functional, but with some interior door shut. Maisie says you make good hot chocolate when it snows, Clara said. Non sequitur, but she'd learned that sometimes non sequiturs were the kindest way to open things a little. He blinked. Then something shifted in his face. Cocoa, he said. I haven't had any since September. We'd need to get some from the store. I could add it to the list, Claire said. He looked at her for a moment. She talked to you about that? She talks to me about quite a lot of things, Claire said. He looked down at his coffee cup and something moved in him that she couldn't quite name. She used to ask her mother for it, he said quietly. Every first snow. It was a thing they did. Clara said nothing. She understood, she thought, that he wasn't telling her this in order for her to respond to it, just that it had needed somewhere to go. Add it to the list, he said after a moment. He picked up his coffee. The conversation closed, but when Clara added it to the list that night in her small room, she wrote it carefully. Cocoa. For first snow. And felt the weight of those 4 words as something she would not lose. The incident she thought about the most, later, the one that changed the shape of things without being, in itself, dramatic, happened on a Thursday afternoon when she was trying to fix the rope and nail latch on the backroom window with a piece of actual hardware she'd found in the barn's tool corner, and Maisie was sitting on the floor behind her talking about, as far as Clara could tell, a horse she had invented that lived in an invented valley and had opinions about the other horses there. Clara was working on the latch and listening to the horse story with about 1/3 of her attention, which was, she had learned, the appropriate amount. Children that age didn't require full attention. They required enough to let them know they were heard, and anything more than about 1/3 was actually too much and made the story self-conscious. And then Nightberry said to the other one, "You can't have the best grass just because you're bigger," Maisie was saying, and then stopped. Clara looked back. Maisie was looking at her with an expression that was a child's version of very serious deliberation. "Clara," she said, "are you going to leave?" The latch sat in Clara's hand. She turned fully around. "Why are you asking that?" she said. "Mrs. Pike at the store told Mrs. Beaumont that you'd probably leave before spring because ladies don't stay here when there's no good reason to." Maisie delivered this information with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who has memorized something important without entirely understanding it. Clara looked at her. Maisie was 4 years old, and she was sitting on the floor with her hands in her lap, and she was asking this question with a studied casualness that didn't hide the thing underneath it, which was fear, small and quiet, and 4 years old, but fear. "I'm not leaving right now," Clara said carefully, "but are you going to leave later?" The honest answer was that she didn't know. The kind answer was something softer than that. She thought about what kind of woman she was becoming in this kitchen, in this cold, in this family's house. "I'm not making plans to leave," she said finally. "That's the truest thing I can tell you right now." Maisie looked at her for a long moment, conducting some internal assessment. Then she uncurled her hands in her lap. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Clara said. "Nightberry also has a foal," Maisie said, as if they'd never diverted. "Her name is Snowbell, but that is not her official name. That is just what I call her." "What's her official name?" Clara asked, turning back to the latch. "I haven't decided yet," Maisie said. "Names are important. You shouldn't rush them." "That's true," Clara said. "You absolutely shouldn't rush names." She got the latch on straight. It held. She tested it twice. The window closed properly and stayed closed, and the cold air that had been coming in around the frame was, for the first time in however long, stopped. She felt unreasonably satisfied by this. It was a window latch. It was not a life, but it was a thing that had been broken and was now fixed by her hands, in this house, and that mattered in a way she was only beginning to understand. By the end of the first month, the house was cleaner and tighter than it had been in the fall. The kitchen ran better. The routine, meals, wood, water, the various repairs she kept finding and addressing with whatever materials were available, had become natural in the way routines do when you've done them enough times to stop thinking about them consciously. Burl and Ames, the second ranch hand, a quiet young man from somewhere in Nebraska, had stopped treating her presence with the careful courtesy of visitors and had started treating it with the more comfortable courtesy of someone who lived there. Burl had taken to leaving his coffee cup on the counter nearest the stove as a hint, which she took, and which he never acknowledged he'd given. She was not comfortable exactly. She was not settled, not in the way she understood that word. She was still a woman without a plan, in a situation without a framework, learning a world she hadn't known existed 2 months ago. But there was Maisie, who ran out of the house to find her when she came back from the barn, who saved her good rocks in a pocket, who told her the horse stories with complete narrative commitment. There was the kitchen window with the gap she'd sealed on the first morning. There was the latch she'd fixed. There was the chimney Rhett had climbed in the cold, and the two of them sitting at the table afterward talking about seasoned wood and fault, and next times, which was its own strange kind of honesty. There was the list in her small room with Coco, her first snow written in her careful hand. There was, she was beginning to realize, slowly, against her better judgment, with full awareness of every reason it was complicated, the quiet sensation of something that had nothing to do with surviving and everything to do with staying. She did not examine that sensation directly. She let it sit at the edge of things, where she could see it without looking at it, the way you can sometimes see stars better in the dark if you don't look straight at them. Outside, the Montana winter kept doing what it did. But inside the house, without anyone declaring it or making a decision about it, something had begun to hold. The cocoa arrived on a Wednesday, tucked into the supply order Rhett brought back from town, and he set it on the kitchen counter without comment, just a small paper-wrapped tin next to the flour and the salt, and Clara saw it and didn't say anything either. That was the shape of things between them by the 6th week. A great deal communicated in the spaces between words, in the placement of objects, in the particular quality of silences that had begun to feel less empty and more like a language neither of them had decided to name yet. It snowed 3 days later. Not the first snow of the season. There had been dustings in December, the kind that came and went and left the ground looking uncertain about itself. But the first real snow, the kind that arrived in the night and had settled 6 inches deep by morning and was still coming when Clara looked out the kitchen window at 5:30. It had a different quality from the earlier snows, heavier and more deliberate, like a decision that had been made. She heated the milk on the low side of the stove. She'd finally mapped it completely, knew exactly where the heat lived and where it didn't, and had the cocoa ready when she heard Maisie's feet on the floor above. The child appeared at the bottom of the stairs with her hair loose and her eyes wide, registered the snow through the window with an intake of breath, and then registered the cup Clara was holding out to her, and her face did something complicated that was trying to be happy and had some sadness running through it at the same time, because she was 4, and she understood what the cocoa meant, and she carried that understanding the way children carry things that are too heavy for them. Not well, but with complete commitment. "It snowed," Maisie said. "It did," Clara said. Maisie took the cup. She held it with both hands. She sat at the table and looked out the window and drank it slowly, and Clara sat across from her and drank her coffee and didn't say anything, because this moment didn't need anything from her except to be present in it. Rhett came in from the early barn check and found them both sitting there in the gray morning light with the snow still falling outside. He stood in the doorway and looked at the cup in Maisie's hands, and something moved in his face that he controlled quickly, the way he always controlled things quickly, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned that feelings are best managed at speed. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Clara said. Maisie looked up at her father. "Clara made the cocoa," she said. "She knew about the first snow." Rhett looked at Clara. Just a moment, just the specific quality of a look that carries more weight than its duration suggests. "Yeah," he said. "She did." He poured his coffee and sat with them, and the 3 of them watched the snow come down, and nobody said much. And that was, Clara thought, exactly what was needed. What nobody could have predicted was that the snow wouldn't stop. It came down through Wednesday and through Thursday, and by Friday morning the temperature had dropped to the kind of number that stops being a measurement and starts being a condition. The air had a density to it, a physical presence, and the wind that came with it off the mountains had changed pitch from the relatively benign howl of ordinary Montana cold to something lower and more serious. Burl came in from his bunkhouse Friday morning with ice in his beard and told Rhett that the northwest sky looked like trouble, and Rhett stood on the porch and looked at it for a long minute and then said, quietly and without drama, that they needed to get the cattle moved to the lower pasture shelter before noon. Clara had learned in 6 weeks to calibrate Rhett's level of concern by the efficiency of his movements. When something was routine, he moved at a working pace, steady and economical. When something required attention, he moved faster but still deliberate. When he came back inside Friday afternoon after the cattle were moved and started checking the woodpile with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that needed to come out right, she understood that this was something in a third category. "How bad?" she asked. "Could be manageable," he said. "Could be worse than that." He looked at the barometer on the wall of the main room, the old brass one that had been there since before he'd owned the house. He'd been checking it every hour. "Pressure's dropping fast." "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her, and she read the look. He was still adjusting to having someone ask that question, to having someone whose answer to a hard situation was not panic or retreat, but "what do you need?" He wasn't all the way used to it yet. "Make sure the water's drawn," he said. "If it gets cold enough fast enough, the pump could freeze. Fill everything you can. The big pots, the wash basin, the bathing tub if you can manage it, and keep Maisie inside." "Done," Clara said. She spent the afternoon drawing water. It was not a small task. The big pot, the smaller ones, the wash basin, the wash tub she wrestled from the back room, every vessel she could find that would hold water without leaking. Her arms ached by the time she was done, and there was ice forming on her coat where the water had splashed. She stoked every stove in the house. The kitchen stove, the main room fireplace, the small iron one in her room. She brought in wood until the pile by the back door was as high as she could stack it. Maisie, for her part, had sensed the change in the air the way children sense things. Not with understanding exactly, but with the animal awareness that the adults were worried and that worry had weight. She stayed close. She didn't argue about being inside. She sat in the main room with her collection of carved wooden animals arranged on the floor and moved them through various scenarios with less than her usual narrative energy. The storm hit fully at 6 o'clock Friday evening. Clara had been through bad weather before. There were winters in Chicago that were genuinely brutal, wind off the lake that could knock you sideways, cold that came through every gap in a boarding house wall. But this was different in the way that reminded her of the difference between reading about something and standing inside it. The wind didn't howl so much as roar, a sustained and enormous sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once and press on the walls of the house as if testing them. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour. Snow came horizontal past the windows, which meant it was no longer falling so much as being thrown. Rhett came in at 7, and the cold that came in with him was a physical thing, a pressure that pushed the warmth back and needed 3 minutes to fully surrender to the fire. He was moving when he came in, efficient and direct, and Clara recognized the mode. Not panic, never panic with him, but the particular focus of a man who has reduced everything to what matters right now. "Burl and Ames are staying in the bunkhouse," he said, pulling off his outer coat and the scarf he'd wrapped 3 times around his face. His face beneath it was red with cold, the cheekbones especially. "I checked the cattle shelter. They're in." He looked at the water she'd drawn, lined up in the kitchen in every available vessel. He looked at the woodpile by the back door. "Good," he said, which was a lot from him. Maisie had come to stand at the kitchen doorway, holding one of her wooden animals, the small horse she called Nightberry's official prototype, a carved thing with a broken ear. She looked at her father. "Is it bad?" she asked. "It's a big storm," Rhett said, without condescension and without false reassurance, which was how he always talked to her, and which Clara had come to think of as one of the better things about him. "We're going to be fine. The house is solid, and we've got wood and water." Maisie nodded. "Clara filled up everything," she said. "I know," Rhett said. "Come here." He picked her up, coat and cold and all, and held her for a moment, and Maisie put her chin on his shoulder and looked at Clara over it with those serious dark eyes. They ate dinner around the kitchen table while the storm made its argument outside. It was a plain meal, cornbread and beans, the reliable standby, and nobody said much, and the lamp on the table made a circle of warmth that felt intentional against the dark and noise beyond the glass. Maisie ate about half of what was on her plate, which was less than usual, and Clara noticed but didn't remark on it. Children ate less when they were anxious. It was a known thing. She did notice, after dinner, when she cleared the plates, that Maisie's forehead was warm. Not dramatically warm. Not the kind of warm that announces itself. The kind that was just slightly more than it should be. The faint heat under her palm when Clara reached to brush the hair from the child's face, which she'd started doing as a natural and unthought gesture sometime in the previous 3 weeks. She didn't say anything at dinner. She watched. She helped Maisie with her bath, which was the nightly routine now, and noted that the child was quieter than usual and that she shivered once getting out of the water, even though the kitchen was warm. She got her into her night clothes and into bed and sat at the edge and told 3 installments of the Nightberry story, which was the required number, and put her hand against Maisie's forehead again at the end of the 3rd one, warmer than before. She found Rhett in the main room checking the fire. "Maisie has a fever," she said. He turned from the fireplace. "How bad?" "Not bad yet, but she's warmer than she was at dinner and she shivered getting out of the bath. It's something." He moved toward the stairs. She stepped aside and then followed because it wasn't a time to think about what was her place and what wasn't. Maisie was awake when they came in. She looked at them with the eyes of a child who knows something is being discussed about them and is trying to decide how to feel about it. "Does your throat hurt?" Rhett asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. "A little," Maisie said, in the way children say things that are more than a little. "Your head?" "Kind of," she said. He put his hand on her forehead, and his expression shifted in the way that parents' expressions shift when they confirm something they were hoping to be wrong about. He looked at Clara. "Doc Heller," he said. "It's blizzard conditions," Clara said carefully. "I know what it is," he said. "Rhett," she kept her voice steady. "If you ride out in this and something happens to you, she needs a doctor." "She needs her father more," Clara said. "And you need to ride 8 miles in a whiteout with the temperature dropping to get a doctor who then has to ride back 8 miles in the same conditions, and I don't like those odds." She paused. She had thought about this already, in the 30 seconds between feeling Maisie's forehead and walking down the stairs, which was how her mind worked, quickly and practically when it needed to. "What do we have in the house?" "The medicine cabinet. The pantry." He looked at her. "What do we have?" she said again. He went and found it. She'd seen the cabinet before, a small wooden box in the back room with a latch, but hadn't examined it closely. He brought it to the kitchen table and they went through it together. A roll of bandage cloth, a small tin of carbolic salve, a bottle of laudanum, a 1/3 full, some dried herbs in paper packets that had lost their labels, a small jar of something that turned out to be a camphor preparation, and at the very back a paper packet that was still legible. Willow bark. Clara picked up the willow bark. It was a reasonable amount, maybe enough for several doses. "Fever," she said. "It's what this is for." She looked at him. "I know it's not a doctor, but willow bark tea for the fever, the camphor on her chest for the congestion, if it gets that way. Keep her warm, but not too warm, fluids as much as she'll take. These are real things. They do real things." He was looking at her, not doubting her, she thought, but assessing, deciding. "My aunt was sick a lot," Clara said, because she understood he needed to know the source. "I learned what I could because there wasn't always money for doctors." She held his gaze. "I'm not guessing, Rhett." He was quiet for a moment, then, "All right," he said. "We try it your way through the night. If she gets worse, we reassess," Clara said. "But let's not go looking for the worst thing before it's here." He nodded. Once. The way he agreed to things he wasn't entirely at peace with but had decided to trust. They went back upstairs. What followed was the longest night Clara had experienced since the night she'd sat in a Chicago hospital hallway waiting to hear about her aunt. And even that was different because that night she'd been helpless, only waiting. And this night she was not helpless. She was working, which was better and worse in different ways at the same time. She made the willow bark tea first, steeping it long, straining it through a piece of clean cloth, sweetening it with the last of the honey because Maisie was 4 years old, and the taste of willow bark without sweetening was a thing Clara remembered from her own childhood, with residual bitterness. She coaxed the child into drinking it in small sips, which required patience and negotiation because Maisie, even sick, was a person with opinions about what went into her mouth. "It's bitter," Maisie said. "It has honey in it," Clara said. "The bitter is louder than the honey." "I know, drink it anyway." Maisie made a face of considerable expressiveness and drank it anyway. The fever climbed through 10 o'clock. Clara had her hand on the child's forehead every half hour, calibrating. At 10 it was up, meaningfully up, the kind of heat that makes you quicken. She kept the room warm but not hot. The instinct was to pile on blankets, to surround the sick with warmth, but she'd learned that a high fever needed air around it, not insulation. She kept one blanket, kept the small stove at a moderate level, kept the window a thread open despite the storm outside because the room needed to breathe. Rhett stayed. She hadn't asked him to and he hadn't announced it. He simply stayed, sitting in the chair in the corner of Maisie's room with his elbows on his knees, and his presence there was not in her way, which was the only requirement she had of it. Around 11, Maisie started talking in the scattered way of fever. Not delirious, not completely removed from sense, but loose, following connections that were only partially available to the outside. She talked about Nightberry. She said something about a red coat. She asked once, with sudden sharp clarity, "Is Mama here?" The silence after that question had its own weight. Rhett said, "No, Bug, but Clara's here." And Maisie said, with the satisfied trust of a child who has received what she needs rather than what she asked for, "Okay." Clara kept her hands busy. Second dose of willow bark tea at midnight, smaller, more concentrated. She dampened a cloth in the water she'd drawn, still cool, the kitchen was cool enough, and laid it across Maisie's forehead and replaced it when it warmed, which it did quickly. She talked to the child in the low, continuous way that she'd found useful during the nighttime wakings of the previous weeks, not about anything important, just words, the sound of a voice that meant safety, the story of the horse in the invented valley. 3 more installments, Nightberry and her foal and the other horses, and the question of the foal's official name, which Clara decided, on the spot, was Ember, and told Maisie so. Maisie was mostly asleep, but she said, from somewhere below the surface of it, "Ember is a good name." And Clara said, "I thought so," and changed the cloth on her forehead again. Around 1 in the morning, Red appeared beside her with a cup of coffee and set it on the small table near her chair without speaking. She picked it up and drank it, and it was the right temperature, not too hot, which meant he'd waited to bring it until it was drinkable. And she thought about that for a moment, the small, continuous attentiveness of it, and then went back to what she was doing. "Her color is better than it was at 10, Clara said quietly. He leaned over and looked at Maisie. "You think so?" "The flush is less high. That's usually a sign the bark is working." She paused. "It's not a guarantee, but it's better than worse." He sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a while. "Her mother was sick for a long time before the end," he said. He said it the way he said things that had been sitting in him for a while. Flat, with all the emphasis gone, like a stone dropped. 2 years. It started with something like this, just a fever, just a bad fever in the winter, and then it didn't stop. Clara said nothing. She changed the cloth. "I know it's not the same thing," he said. "I know that. But when she's like this..." He stopped. "I know," Clara said. "You can't possibly know," he said. And it wasn't harsh, just honest. The specific honesty of grief that resists the shorthand of empathy. "You're right," she said. "I can't know that. I know what it's like to sit in a room with someone sick and feel like everything you can do isn't enough." She looked at him. "I know that." He looked back at her. In the low light from the small lamp, she'd kept it low because light bothered fever. His face was more open than she'd seen it. The interior door that was usually mostly shut was tonight ajar. "She's going to be all right," Clara said. And she was aware that she didn't know that, couldn't promise that illness in children in winter in Montana in 1882 was not a thing that could be sworn to. But she also meant it, with the full weight of what she intended to do through the rest of this night and however many more it required, and she thought he understood that the certainty she was offering was not about the outcome but about the effort. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. He looked back at his daughter. They stayed like that, the two of them, through the rest of the night. The storm outside kept its argument up all night long, steady and massive. The kind of sound that after a while you stopped hearing consciously and instead just felt, a low vibration in the walls and the floor, the voice of something immensely larger than any of them going about its own incomprehensible business. The lamp burned. The small stove ticked. Clara replaced the cloth, administered the third dose of willow bark tea at 3 a.m. to a child who was now mostly asleep and had to be very gently woken and persuaded, and then sat back and counted Maisie's breaths, which she'd been doing every 20 minutes since midnight without consciously deciding to. At 3:30, she put her hand on the child's forehead and felt it. The heat had broken. Not gone. Not completely. There was still warmth there, but the quality of it had changed from dry and high to something softer and slightly damp, the particular warmth of a fever, releasing rather than building. And Clara sat back in her chair and let out a breath that felt like it had been in her lungs since 10 o'clock. "It's breaking," she said. Rhett was awake. She didn't think he'd slept at all. He came from his chair in one movement and put his own hand where hers had been, and she watched his face. The exact moment his hand felt what hers had felt. The release in his shoulders, the thing that moved behind his eyes that he didn't try to hide this time. He straightened up. He pressed the back of his wrist to his mouth for a moment, the knuckles against his lips, and then he dropped his hand and cleared his throat. "Good," he said. His voice had something rough in it. "She'll sleep now," Clara said. "Better sleep. The fever coming down usually does that." He nodded. He stood over his daughter for another minute, watching her breathe, and then he moved to the doorway. "Clara," he said. She looked up at him. "Thank you," he said. She'd been thanked before. She'd been thanked for cooking and for cleaning and for fixing the window latch and for any number of practical services rendered, and she'd received those thanks with a nod because they were appropriate acknowledgement of appropriate work. This was different, and she knew it was different, and she knew he knew it too. He wasn't thanking her for a service. He was thanking her for something that didn't have a clean name. "You don't need to," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him. There was that almost smile again, the one she'd been cataloging for 6 weeks, and it was slightly more present tonight than it had ever been before. She felt something move in her that she'd been trying not to look at directly, and tonight she let herself look at it for exactly 1 second before she put it down again. "Go get some sleep," she said. "I'll stay with her." "You've been up all night." "So have you, and at least one of us has been awake for 20 hours before this. Go sleep. I'll call you if anything changes." He looked like he was going to argue, and then decided not to. He looked at Maisie one more time, and then at Clara, and then he went. She sat in the room through the rest of the night. Around 5, Maisie stirred properly and looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they'd been since dinner. "My head feels heavy," she said. "That'll be around for a little while," Clara said. "The fever broke. You're going to feel better today." Maisie considered this. "Did I sleep a long time?" "Yes." "Did you stay?" "Yes." Maisie absorbed this. She pulled the blanket up to her chin. "The whole time?" "The whole time," Clara said. The child looked at her with those dark eyes that were her father's eyes and her mother's eyes and her own eyes all at once. And something in them was quiet in a different way than the usual quiet, not guarded or uncertain but settled, the way something settles when it has found where it belongs. "Okay," Maisie said. She closed her eyes. She slept again, and this time the quality of her sleep was different from the previous hours. Slower, deeper, the genuine rest of a body that has been through something and is now doing the real work of healing. Clara sat in the chair and watched the pale gray light of a Montana morning begin to come through the curtains. The storm had quieted sometime in the night. She hadn't noticed when exactly, and the silence outside was the specific silence of a world that has been covered in snow, muffled and still, and different from any other quiet. She was exhausted, the kind of exhausted that lives in the bones rather than just the muscles, the kind that doesn't go away with a nap but requires something longer and more complete. She was also, she realized, very hungry, having not eaten since dinner, but mostly she sat there and let the quiet be what it was. Rhett appeared in the doorway at 5:30, dressed and clearly having not slept more than an hour. He looked at Maisie first, then at Clara. "How is she?" he said, low. "Sleeping well," Clara said. "The fever broke around 3:30. She woke briefly at 5 and was clear-eyed. I think the worst is past." He came into the room and stood looking at his daughter, and this time he didn't try to manage his face at all. He just let what was there be there, and Clara looked away to give him a moment of privacy for it. After a minute, he said, "I'll start breakfast." "I'll do it," Clara said, beginning to stand. "Sit down," he said quietly, but with a firmness that wasn't a request. "You've been up all night. Sit down. Let me do something useful." She sat back down. It was oddly one of the hardest things she'd done since arriving at the ranch. Not the work, not the cold, not the night she'd just been through, but this, sitting still and being looked after. She wasn't practiced at it. She wasn't sure she'd ever been. She heard him moving in the kitchen below. The particular sounds of the stove being stoked, the coffee going on, the pan being set down, a rhythm she'd made herself over 6 weeks, that it was strange to hear from a distance, reversed. When she came downstairs eventually, leaving Maisie sleeping, there was coffee and there were scrambled eggs and there was toast made from the bread she'd baked 2 days ago, slightly thick because he'd cut it without a guide. She sat at the kitchen table and ate without speaking, and he sat across from her and ate in the same silence, and outside the window, the world was white and motionless, the storm completely over. The sky beginning to go from gray to the particular pale gold of a winter morning. Burl knocked at the back door at 7, ice on his coat, face pink with cold, wanting to know the state of things. Rhett filled him in, and Burl asked after Maisie with genuine concern and was told she'd be all right, and he nodded with visible relief and said he'd check the cattle and the water situation and report back. When he was gone, the kitchen was quiet again. Clara was on her second cup of coffee. She was looking at the window, at the snow-covered land beyond it, flat and enormous and white, all the way to where the mountains rose up into the pale gold sky. "The pump froze," Rhett said. "I figured it might," Clara said. "I'll get it thawed out this morning. The water you drew last night will see us through." He looked at the rows of filled pots and vessels still lined up along the counter. "That was—" He stopped. "Practical," she said. "I was going to say it saved us from a real problem," he said. He was looking at the counter still. "You thought of it before I did. You were thinking about the cattle and the bunkhouse and the shelter. I was thinking about the kitchen." She looked at her cup. "It's not better thinking, just different." He was quiet a moment. "No," he said. "It was better thinking, in that situation. Don't do that." She looked at him. "Don't make yourself smaller than you were last night," he said, straightforwardly, without heat, just as a fact he felt needed stating. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the train platform and Edmund Graves's flat assessment. She thought about Mrs. Colton and the appearance of things. She thought about $11 and a trunk and a narrow bed with a bolt on the door. She thought about the night she'd just come through. "All right," she said, and meant it. The snow-covered world outside the window held its quiet. Upstairs, Maisie slept. The stove ticked. The coffee was good. Clara Whitmore sat in that kitchen, in that house, at that table, and something in her, something she'd been keeping loose, uncommitted, available for departure, settled down and put its weight on the floor. She wasn't sure she'd have been able to say, if anyone had asked, exactly when it had happened. Whether it was the moment Maisie had said okay at 1 in the morning, or the moment the fever had broken under her hand, or the moment Rhett had said, "Don't make yourself smaller than you were last night," or whether it had been accumulating quietly for 6 weeks, and this had just been the night it arrived. She didn't examine it, she just let it be what it was. She was still in the chair when Maisie called from upstairs, asking for water, and for Clara, in that order, and Clara stood up and found she wasn't as tired as she'd expected. Or maybe she was, and it simply didn't matter, and she poured a cup of water and went up the stairs. Maisie recovered in the way children recover from fevers, not gradually, not with the slow, measured progress of adults, but in a rush, as if her body had simply decided the illness was finished and moved on without consulting anyone. By the second day after the fever broke, she was eating properly. By the third day, she was back on the floor with her wooden animals, narrating Nightberry's ongoing saga with full creative investment. By the fourth day, she was asking to go outside and see the snow. And Rhett said not yet, and she accepted this with visible reluctance and went back to her horses. And Clara watched this small domestic exchange from the kitchen doorway and felt something that had no clean name and that she wasn't going to try to give one. The town knew about the storm and the fever within a week, because the town always knew. Burl had mentioned it to someone at the feed store, which was all it took. People in Harlan Creek treated information the way the land treated water. It found its level by the most available path. By the following Wednesday, when Clara made the supply run herself in the wagon, 3 separate people had asked after Maisie, and 2 of those people were ones who had previously been in the category of Mrs. Colton's Silent Opinion Brigade. A woman at the dry goods store, whose name Clara didn't know, said she was glad the child had come through all right, and said it with a sincerity that was different from the careful social courtesy Clara had been receiving for the previous 6 weeks. She didn't make too much of it. She thanked the woman and bought her flour and drove back out to the ranch. But she noticed it. What changed between her and Rhett was harder to describe because it didn't happen in a single moment, and it didn't announce itself. It was more like the way light shifts in a room as the sun moves. You don't see the shift happening. You just look up and realize the quality of things is different from what it was an hour ago. He had always been courteous. He had always been fair. He had always been in the particular way of men who carry a great deal and have decided to carry it efficiently, present without being open. After the night of the fever, some of those qualities were the same and some were different in ways that were specific enough to notice but difficult enough to articulate that she spent time trying and mostly couldn't. He asked her opinion on things. Not big things at first, whether the south fence line should be repaired now or could wait until the thaw, whether the root vegetables she'd found in the cold storage were still worth using or had gone too far. He asked in the way a man asks when he actually wants to know the answer, not when he's being polite and expects agreement. Once she said the carrots were fine and the parsnips were not, and he looked at the parsnips himself and concurred, and she had the strange sensation of being consulted by someone who trusted the consultation. You could plant more next summer, she said, because they were already there looking at the cold storage and the thought had occurred to her. Root vegetables do well in the short season up here, turnips especially. If you put in a proper kitchen garden on the south side of the house, you'd have— She stopped because she'd heard herself say you could, and then you'd have and had realized what she was doing, which was planning a future on this land with the casualness of someone who lived here, who intended to live here. Sorry, she said. That's not my— No, he said, and his voice had something careful in it, something deliberate. Keep going. What were you saying about turnips? She looked at him. He looked back at her. The cold storage was dim and smelled of earth and old wood, and his face in the low light had the quality she'd learned to read as him choosing to be more present than he usually allowed himself, the interior door a little wider than its default position. I was saying you'd have a better root supply going into next winter if you put in a full garden row in May, she said steadily. Turnips, parsnips, possibly beets. The soil on the south side gets enough sun even at this latitude. You'd need someone to tend it, he said. Still careful, still deliberate. Yes, Clara said. You would. The silence after that was the kind that has a shape to it, a specific density, the kind where both people are aware of what's in it and are making different decisions about whether to open it. Rhett was the one who looked away first, back at the shelves of cold storage. I'll think about the south side, he said, and she understood that he didn't mean turnips. She said nothing. She picked up the good carrots and left the parsnips and went back to the house. The conversation that actually changed things happened on a Saturday evening in late January when Maisie was asleep and Burl had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the main room had that quality it sometimes got in the evenings. Lamp lit, fire going, the work of the day finished, a space that was nobody's task, and therefore, briefly, just a place where people existed. Clara was mending one of Maisie's dresses, a small blue thing with a tear at the sleeve seam from where she'd caught it on the fence post she wasn't supposed to be climbing. Rhett was at the table with the ranch accounts, which he did on Saturday evenings, going through the ledger with the focused expression of someone conducting a conversation with numbers that required full attention. They'd been sitting like that for perhaps half an hour when he set down his pen. I need to say something to you, he said. Clara put down the dress. She'd been expecting this in some form. She'd been expecting it for a while. She wasn't sure which version of it she was expecting. "All right," she said. He was looking at the ledger for a moment, not reading it, just looking at it the way people look at something nearby when they're assembling what they're going to say. Then he looked at her. "When I offered you the room in December," he said, "I was doing what the situation required. I want you to know that I understand the difference between that and—" He paused. He was choosing words carefully, the way he did everything, with the methodical attention of a man who doesn't waste motion. "And what I'm saying now." "What are you saying now?" Clara said, because she was not going to help him too much. She'd been helped past the hard parts her whole life, and she'd learned it didn't serve her. He looked at her directly. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the housekeeper. Not as a temporary arrangement. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider—" He stopped again. He was not a man who fumbled with words often. She got the sense that this particular sentence had resisted him considerably. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to marry me," he said. The room was quiet. The fire shifted in the grate. Clara had thought about this possibility. She'd thought about it in the abstract, with the careful distance she applied to things she didn't want to invest in before she knew if they were real. She'd thought about all the ways it was complicated, the situation they were already in, the things that had happened between December and now, the small girl sleeping upstairs who had already become a fact of her life in a way that would not unbecome. She'd thought about Rhett's wife, whose photograph was still on the mantel, and about grief, and about whether a man was available to someone in the way that mattered when he was still in some interior room, occupied by someone else. She'd thought about Edmund Graves and what it meant to be chosen, and what it meant to be chosen for the right reasons. "Why?" she said. He blinked. Not the response he'd expected. "I want to understand why," she said. "Not what the situation is, not what makes practical sense, not what Maisie needs or what the ranch needs or what the town thinks about an unmarried woman on a man's property. Why you are asking me, what this is to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Because the night of the blizzard," he said slowly, "you didn't ask me what to do. You looked at what was available, and you made a decision, and you held to it all night, and it was the right call. And I've been thinking about that every day since." He paused. "I've been thinking about a lot of things since then, about who you are, about the fact that every time something in this house was broken, you found a way to fix it. And every time Maisie needed something, you were there before I'd thought to arrange it. And every time I—" He stopped. He was not a man who spoke about himself easily, and this part was evidently harder. "Every time I've been in a room with you these past weeks, it's been the best part of what was happening in that room. And I didn't expect that." He said the last sentence with the honesty of a man admitting something he'd resisted for a while. "I didn't look for it, and I didn't expect it." Clara looked at him for a long time. "I'm not going to marry you out of gratitude," she said. "I'm not asking you to. Or because I don't have anywhere else to go. I know that. Because both of those were true in December, and they were good reasons to accept a room and a temporary arrangement, but they are not reasons to spend your life with someone. I know that too," he said, with a steadiness that matched hers. "I need you to understand," Clara said, "that if I say yes, I'm not saying yes to a position. I'm not agreeing to be the person who manages the house and raises the child and is grateful for the situation. I'm saying yes to being equal to you in this. In the decisions about the land and the money and what we build here. Equal." She held his gaze. "I watched my aunt defer to everyone around her entire life and apologize for existing, and I watched what it did to her. I won't do that." Rhett looked at her. Something was happening in his face that she couldn't entirely categorize. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. Like someone seeing a thing they'd been trying to identify suddenly come into focus. "I'm not asking you to defer to anyone," he said. "Least of all, me." "Good," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked. She thought about it. She was aware this might look, from the outside, like hesitation or uncertainty. But it wasn't that. It was something more deliberate than that. The specific act of making sure she was choosing from the right part of herself, not the frightened part, not the grateful part, not the practical part, but the part that had stood on a frozen train platform and refused to take Edmund Graves's money and then turned around and found its own way. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He let out a breath. She hadn't known he'd been holding one. "All right," he said. All right, she said. They looked at each other across the main room of the house she'd been living in for 7 weeks, and neither of them moved for a moment. And then she picked up the mending, and he picked up his pen, and they went back to their respective work, which was the most honest possible response to what had just happened. Not a performance of the moment, not a dramatization, just two people who had said true things to each other and were now continuing to exist in the same room, which was, in its own way, what they were agreeing to do for the rest of their lives. Maisie found out at breakfast the following morning. The question of how to tell a 4-year-old this particular piece of information had occupied Clara for part of the previous night, and she'd come to the conclusion that with Maisie, directness was always better, because the child could detect softening the way animals detected weather, with some internal instrument of unfailing accuracy. Rhett told her at the kitchen table over eggs and toast, simple and direct. Clara has agreed to marry me, he said. She's going to be part of our family. Maisie looked at him. She looked at Clara. She ate a piece of toast. Does that mean she stops leaving? She said. She was never leaving, Clara said. Mrs. Pike said she would, Maisie said. Mrs. Pike, Clara said carefully, doesn't know everything. Maisie considered this revelation about the limits of Mrs. Pike's omniscience with visible interest. Then she looked at Clara with a question in her eyes that was more careful than the others, more privately held. Can I call you Mama? She asked. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this small person across the table, this child with dark eyes and opinions about horse names and a too-heavy pitcher and 3 installments of a story every night and rocks saved in her pockets, and felt the full weight of the question, which was not a small weight. If you want to, she said, that's up to you. If you ever want to call me Clara instead, that's also all right. Whenever you feel like it means what you want it to mean. Maisie thought about this with her characteristic seriousness. I think Mama, she said, because you stayed the whole night when I was sick. I'll stay the whole night every time, Clara said. Maisie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her eggs. Rhett was looking at the table, not at either of them, and his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something he'd decided wasn't going to move his face. The town's reaction to the engagement was, as Rhett had predicted, complicated. There was a layer of it that was genuinely warm. Burl shook Rhett's hand with the full-body conviction of a man who'd been hoping for exactly this outcome and wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and pressed Clara's hand with both of his and said she was the steadiest woman he'd seen in a hard season, which was more than sufficient. Doc Heller, whom Clara had met properly in January when he'd come out to check Maisie post-fever and had ended up staying for coffee and 2 hours of conversation, expressed his congratulations with the dry warmth of a man who'd seen a lot of lives and knew a good decision when he observed one. Mrs. Colton came to call. Of course she did. She came on a Tuesday, alone this time, and she sat in the main room that Clara had spent 2 months making as functional and decent as possible. And she had tea, and she was quiet for a little while in the way of someone arranging what they mean to say. People are talking, she said finally. They were talking before, Clara said. I don't expect that's changed. They're saying it's too fast, Mrs. Colton said, that you... She paused, choosing words. That the situation explains it. That you needed a position and he needed help with the child, and that a marriage certificate is a way of making that arrangement look like something else. Clara looked at her steadily. She had spent 2 months building the capacity to be looked at by this town without flinching, and it had cost her something to build it, and she was not going to waste what it had cost. Do you believe that? She asked. Mrs. Colton looked at her in return, and Clara had the sense of a woman doing a genuine reassessment, not just a social one. I think, she said slowly, that what I believe matters less than what I've observed. And what I've observed is that Rhett Callahan has been carrying this ranch and that child on his own for 2 years, and that since December he's carrying them differently. Imi Jansson ditis. She paused. I observed that child had a serious fever in that blizzard, and that you got her through it without losing your head. And I observed that Rhett is not the kind of man who makes decisions like this out of convenience. No, Clara said. He isn't. But people will still talk, Mrs. Colton said. People will still talk, Clara agreed. And the only thing I know to do about that is to continue being exactly who I am and doing exactly what I do, and let the time make the argument I can't make myself. Mrs. Colton was quiet a moment. Then she said, "The ladies' auxiliary, first Friday of the month." "I know," Clara said. "It would be a good time to come," Mrs. Colton said, and the way she said it was different from the first time she'd said it, 6 weeks ago. That time it had been a monitoring mechanism. This time it sounded more like an extension of a hand. "I'll be there," Clara said. Edmund Graves came to the ranch on a Thursday in early February. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horse outside, and she looked through the window and recognized him immediately. The good coat, the careful posture, and felt something happen in her chest that was neither fear nor anger, but a kind of flat watchfulness, the way you feel when a weather system you've been tracking finally arrives. She didn't go to the door. She continued doing what she'd been doing, which was preparing the dough for tomorrow's bread. And she heard Rhett's boots on the porch, and heard the door open, and heard voices. When Rhett came in, his expression was the closed, operational one she'd learned to read, as him having dealt with something he'd needed to manage carefully. "Graves is here," he said. "I know," she said. "He wants to speak with you." He paused. "You don't have to." "I know that too," she said. She wiped her hands on her apron. She thought about it for a moment, the length of time it takes to decide what kind of person you are going to be in a moment that you can't take back. Then she went to the door. Graves was standing on the porch. He looked, she thought, mostly the same as he had on the train platform in December, with the addition of the specific quality of a man who has come to do something uncomfortable and knows it. "Miss Whitmore?" he said. "Callahan," she said. He blinked. Then he understood she was using Rhett's name, which wasn't accurate yet, but felt true, and she wasn't going to call herself Whitmore to this man. "I heard about the engagement," he said. "Most people have," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her in a way that was different from the way he'd looked at her on the platform. Not the appraising inventory-style look of before, but something more uncomfortable. The look of a man confronting the gap between what he'd assumed and what turned out to be true. "I came to say—" He stopped, tried again. "I handled December badly." "Yes," Clara said. "You did. I'd had correspondence from the agency for weeks, and I'd built up an expectation. And when you arrived and you weren't—" He stopped again. "What?" she said. She was not going to help him. "What I'd imagined," he said, which was more honest than she'd expected from him. "And I took that disappointment out on you in front of people, and that was wrong. And I've thought about it a number of times since." Clara looked at him. She thought about the train platform, the cold, the crowd. She thought about the two men in the dark after, and the walk to the boarding house, and the door that closed. She thought about $11 and a trunk, and the choice she'd made at the station to turn down his money. "All right," she said. He blinked. "That's all? What else would you like me to say?" she said. "You were unkind to me in a way that had real consequences, and you know it, and you've come here to say so, and I've heard it. That's a complete transaction." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not carrying it around with me. I've got better things to carry." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression that might have been relief and might have been something else, something more like respect arriving late. "You're different than I expected," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I tend to be." She went back inside. She went back to her bread dough. She heard his horse leave, and then the sound of it was gone, and the kitchen was just the kitchen again, with the stove ticking and the cold pressing at the window and the dough under her hands. Rhett appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Well?" he said. He apologized, Clara said. "I accepted. It's done." He looked at her. "You're all right?" "I'm fine," she said. And she was. She was genuinely fine, which was different from the way people say they're fine when they're not. She was actually fine in the full sense, which was its own kind of information about who she'd become in the last 2 months. A woman who had stood on a frozen platform in December with nowhere to go did not need to be broken by a man with a good coat coming to say sorry in February. She was too far from December for that. "You could have been harder on him," Rhett said. "I could have," she agreed. "Didn't seem worth the energy." She looked at him. "He did me a favor, if I'm being accurate. If he'd kept his word in December, I'd be spending my evenings in the back of a dry goods store counting inventory." Rhett's mouth did the almost smile thing, more present now than it had ever been. "Is that what you'd have been doing?" "That's what he said the work was," Clara said. Inventory management and household supervision. I'd have been organized and deeply bored within a week. She looked back at her dough. This is better. Inventory management, he said with the particular dry quality that passed for his version of humor. Don't laugh, she said. I've made a very informed comparison. The almost smile became an actual one. Brief, real, a thing that arrived and stayed for a full 3 seconds before it resolved back into his usual expression. She'd been seeing them more often these past weeks, actual smiles, not just the almost ones. She didn't remark on it, she just noted them, the way she noted the good ones. The planning for the wedding was practical rather than ceremonial, which suited both of them. Clara had no family to involve and no resources to spend on elaborate arrangements, and Rhett's approach to most things was sufficient rather than excessive. They agreed on late March, when the worst of the winter would be past, and the mud of the spring thaw would be just beginning, which was not a romantic timing but was honest. What Clara cared about, practically, was what came after. She had spent February thinking through the specifics with the kind of methodical attention she brought to all logistical problems, and one evening she brought the subject to the table. I want to talk about the ranch finances, she said. Rhett looked up from his coffee. Not to interfere, she said, but if I'm going to be a partner in what we're building here, I need to understand the actual numbers, what the ranch earns, what it owes, what the margins look like in a good year versus a bad one. He looked at her for a moment, and she waited to see if he was going to hedge or redirect, and he didn't. He got up and got the ledger. They sat at the table for 2 hours. He went through the numbers and she asked questions and he answered them, and by the end of it she had a picture of the ranch that was more specific than the general one she'd been building in her head. It was a ranch that was functional and stable but not expansive, with good cattle stock and manageable debt from the expansion he'd done 3 years ago, and a cash reserve that was adequate but thin going into the spring season. The margins on cattle are always uncertain, she said, looking at the ledger. Weather, disease, market prices. Yes, he said, you need something that produces a steadier income in the gaps. She was thinking while she was talking, which was something she did, and which Rhett had learned to recognize and let run rather than interrupting. Not livestock, something that doesn't depend on the same variables. She looked at the window. Chickens? He looked at her. Us eggs, she said. Poultry. I know that sounds small, he said. It sounds small, she agreed, but the demand in Harlan Creek is constant. The hotel needs eggs. The boarding house needs eggs. Every family in town needs eggs and gets them unreliably from whoever has them, at whatever price is being asked that week. A proper laying operation, consistent supply at a fair price, is a business that doesn't care what the cattle market does in November. He was quiet, looking at the ledger. It's not the main thing, she said. It's the thing that holds while the main thing has a bad year. Where would you build a proper coop, he said, which meant he was considering it, not dismissing it. South side, she said, near the kitchen garden I was going to plant. He looked at her. The corners of his eyes did something that wasn't quite the smile but was adjacent to it. The turnips, he said. And the chickens, she said. He looked at the ledger for another moment. He tapped his pen against the page twice. How many birds would you need to start, he said. And that was how it began. Not with a grand declaration about the future, but with a practical conversation at a kitchen table about chickens and turnips and the margins on eggs, which was the most honest version of what they were building together, and which Clara thought, privately, said more about the real nature of the thing than any ceremony could manage. By the end of February, the engagement was established fact in Harlan Creek, and the reactions had mostly settled into their final positions. Most people had come around to something between acceptance and genuine goodwill, led in part by Mrs. Colton, who had attended the February Ladies' Auxiliary meeting with Clara and introduced her in a way that was measurably warmer than Clara had expected, and in part by Doc Heller, whose opinion in the town operated as a kind of unofficial certification system, and who had told anyone who asked that Rhett Callahan was a good man who'd done well for himself, and that Clara Whitmore was a woman with more practical intelligence than most people he'd encountered in 15 years of frontier medicine. There were still holdouts. There were always holdouts, and Clara had stopped expecting otherwise. Mrs. Pike at the store remained cool in the specific manner of someone who has decided something and is too committed to the decision to revise it regardless of evidence. A family called the Hendersons, who had known Rhett's wife and had strong feelings about the appropriate interval between loss and replacement, made their disapproval known through the precise social mechanism of not making it known, which Clara found she could live with. What she couldn't dismiss and didn't try to was the simpler version of their concern. Rhett had loved his wife. That was not a small thing, and it wasn't a finished thing, and she knew it. The photograph was still on the mantel. She'd never asked him to move it. It belonged there, and she belonged here, and those two facts could exist in the same house without one of them having to eliminate the other. She was not trying to replace anyone. She was building something that hadn't existed before, which was its own thing entirely. She said as much to Maisie one evening in the middle of the 14th installment of the Nightberry saga. "Your mama will always be your mama," Clara said. "Nothing about what's happening changes that." Maisie was quiet for a moment. She was holding the small carved horse with the broken ear. "I know," she said, "but you stayed the whole night when I was sick." She looked at Clara. "Mama couldn't stay. She was already gone." Clara looked at this child and felt the particular ache of someone trying to hold a thing carefully because it was both fragile and immensely important. "I know," she said. "So I think," Maisie said, with the gravity of someone announcing a position they've arrived at after long deliberation, "that I can love you both. One didn't leave because she wanted to. One came because she wanted to. Those are different kinds of love, but they both count." Clara sat with that for a moment. "Where did you learn to think like that?" she said. Maisie considered. "I think I thought it myself," she said with modest pride. "I think you did too," Clara said. She told Rhett what Maisie had said that evening after the child was asleep. She told it simply, without editorializing, and he listened the way he listened to things that mattered, with his full attention and very little visible response, because with him, the depth of the listening was in the quality of the silence afterward. "She's something," he said finally. "She really is," Clara said. They were in the main room again, the usual evening configuration, fire and lamp, and the work that was never fully finished. The photograph was on the mantel. Clara looked at it briefly, and then at the fire. "I know this isn't simple," she said, what we're doing. "I know there are things in it that are complicated and will stay complicated. Most worthwhile things are," he said. "I'm not expecting easy," she said. "I want you to know that. I don't need easy. I need honest." He turned his head and looked at her with that quality of attention she'd come to understand as one of the truest things about him. He was fully present when he was present. No partial attention, no half-listening. "When Rhett Callahan looked at you, he was actually looking." "Then you've got that," he said. "For whatever it's worth." "It's worth a lot," she said. She held his gaze, and in the firelight, the complicated thing between them was just what it was. Not simple, not without history, not without the marks of what had shaped each of them before December, but real, present. Two people choosing each other with clear eyes, which is the only honest way to do it. Outside, the Montana winter was beginning, just barely, to think about loosening. The temperatures were still brutal in the mornings, still the kind that made the air sharp and visible with every breath. But the light was different, staying a little longer each day now, the way it did at this latitude when February edged toward March, the sun returning to the sky at a more committed angle. It wasn't spring. It wasn't anywhere close to spring. But it was the first indication that spring intended to arrive eventually, which was its own kind of thing. Clara Whitmore sat in the main room of the house she'd come to as a stranger in December and thought about turnips and chickens and egg margins and a ceremony at the end of March, and about a small girl who had developed a personal philosophy of love while narrating horse stories, and about a man with an interior door that was opening incrementally, and she felt, not happy exactly, happiness being too simple a word for something this layered, but right, like a thing in the right place, like a fit that had been made by actual use rather than design, the kind that holds better for it. The fire burned. The lamp held its small circle of warmth. The house was quiet in the way it got, when everyone who belonged in it was accounted for, and outside the long Montana darkness pressed against the glass. And for the first time in her life, Clara didn't feel like she was on the wrong side of it. The wedding happened on a Saturday at the end of March, which turned out to be one of those early spring days in Montana that arrives like an argument against winter. Cold still, always cold at that altitude at that time of year, but with a quality of light that was different from February's light, sharper and more honest. The sun at an angle that meant business. The mud was exactly as present as Clara had predicted when they'd picked the date. The kind of deep spring mud that grabbed at boot heels and had opinions about wagon wheels. And she'd told Rhett when they were planning it that mud was honest and she didn't mind it. And he'd said that was one of the things he appreciated about her. And it was the closest he'd come to a romantic declaration, and she'd accepted it as the genuine thing it was. They married at the courthouse in Harlan Creek because neither of them wanted a production. Judge Alderman, a compact man with a gray beard and the brisk efficiency of someone who had performed this particular ceremony enough times to have an opinion about which parts actually mattered, read the relevant words in about 4 minutes. Burl was there. Doc Heller was there. Mrs. Colton had come, which Clara had not expected and which said something she chose to acknowledge simply by meeting the woman's eyes and nodding. Maisie stood between them in her good dress, the blue one Clara had mended twice, the sleeve seam now reinforced with a double stitch, and held both their hands during the relevant portion, which nobody had planned but which turned out to be exactly right. After, they ate at the hotel dining room, which was the only restaurant in Harlan Creek and whose cook had good days and bad days. That day was a reasonably good one. Burl told 3 stories that grew in elaboration with each telling, and Maisie ate more bread than was advisable and fell asleep against Clara's arm before the dessert arrived. And Doc Heller talked to Rhett about the state of the territory's cattle market for 45 minutes, while Clara talked to Mrs. Colton about the Ladies' Auxiliary Spring Charitable Project. And it was ordinary and imperfect and real, which was all Clara had wanted it to be. On the drive back to the ranch, Maisie asleep between them on the wagon bench the way she'd been on that first night in December, Clara looked out at the land. The mountains were still snow-capped, but the lower slopes were beginning to show through, brown and gray beneath the white, the land reasserting itself. The road was bad with the mud, but the horse was steady, and Rhett drove with the unhurried competence of a man who had made this road in all conditions for 11 years. "Well," he said after a while. "Well," she agreed. He looked at the road. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You?" "Yes," he said, with the particular weight of someone for whom that single syllable carries more than its size suggests. They drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable quiet, and when they got there, Rhett carried Maisie inside and put her to bed and came back downstairs, and Clara had made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. And it was just the kitchen, just the table, just the 2 of them in the house that was now wholly and officially theirs, and that was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough. The chickens arrived in April, 12 laying hens and a rooster Clara had sourced through a farm 40 miles east, negotiated for by letter over 6 weeks, with a patience and specificity that Rhett had observed with quiet admiration. She'd researched breeds, had asked Doc Heller's wife, who had kept poultry in Ohio before coming west, which varieties held up best in high-altitude cold, and had settled on a mixed flock that favored hardiness over maximum production. Because in Montana, the winter was always the variable that mattered most. The coop went up on the south side of the house where she'd always planned it, built by Rhett and Burl over a weekend in early April with lumber she'd specified dimensions for, and which Rhett had cut without comment when he'd seen the measurements were precise and considered. Burl had asked, hammering the south wall, whether Clara had built coops before, and she'd said no, and he'd looked at the plans she'd drawn on the back of a flour sack and said they were better than the plans for the first structure he'd ever built, which had been a latrine in the army and had collapsed on its 3rd day of use. "High bar," Clara said. "Still a bar," Burl said, with complete sincerity. The kitchen garden went in alongside the coop, 3 rows of turnips, 2 of parsnips, beets, and a longer row of various kitchen herbs she'd started indoors from seeds she'd ordered with the same letter that arranged the chickens. Maisie helped plant the beet seeds with the focused enthusiasm of a child doing important work, and she patted each small planted area with her palm afterward, as if encouraging individual seeds, which Clara thought was both unnecessary and entirely reasonable. "Do they know to grow?" Maisie asked. "They know," Clara said. "They just need the right conditions." Maisie patted another section. "I'm encouraging them," she said. "That can't hurt," Clara said. The egg business was not, in its early months, the clean, successful enterprise of someone's imagining. It was messier and more educational than that. 3 of the 12 hens turned out to be inconsistent producers, laying in patterns that seemed connected to some private schedule Clara couldn't decode. The rooster had a personality that required management. One hen, whom Maisie named Adelaide with immediate conviction, proved to be both the best layer and the most opinionated individual on the property, and would periodically escape the coop and be found in the kitchen, examining things. "She's inspecting," Maisie always said when this happened. "She's trespassing," Clara always said, and caught Adelaide and returned her. But the eggs were consistent enough by May to justify the first delivery to the hotel, a dozen to start, negotiated at a price that was fair, in which the hotel's owner, a man named Garrett, who ran the dining room with chronic anxiety about supply reliability, received with visible relief. By June, it was 2 dozen weekly to the hotel, and a standing order from Mrs. Colton, who ran a household that baked seriously, and 3 families in town who had heard about the arrangement and asked to be included. By August, the flock had grown to 20 birds, and the income, modest but steady, was doing exactly what Clara had said it would do. Holding through the uncertain period when the cattle margins were being squeezed by a drought that was hitting the eastern grazing land and creating pressure on feed costs across the territory. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the story anyone would tell first about the Callahan Ranch. But it was real money at a moment when real money mattered, and Rhett knew it and said so. And Clara accepted the acknowledgement without deflecting it, because she'd been working on that, on not making herself smaller when someone recognized the full size of what she'd done. The drought that summer was genuine hardship. It dried the creek that fed the lower pasture to a thin thread by August and required moving the herd twice and sinking a new well that cost more than Rhett had planned and took 3 weeks that he'd needed for other work. Clara watched him carry that summer with the same efficiency he brought to hard things, functional and managing, but she also saw what it cost him in the evenings. The particular quality of tiredness that isn't just physical, the kind that accumulates from sustained pressure without resolution. She didn't try to fix it. She'd learned in the months since December that the impulse to fix things was not always the right response to the things that couldn't be fixed. She cooked the meals and kept the household and managed the egg business and handled the correspondence and the accounts. And she sat with him in the evenings when the tiredness was on him and didn't ask him to be more than he was. Once in August, she put her hand over his on the table. Just that. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while without speaking, and that was its own kind of conversation, complete and sufficient. The rain came in September, late and inadequate but real, and the creek recovered somewhat, and by October the worst of the drought year was behind them. They'd lost fewer cattle than the neighboring ranches because Rhett's early decisions about the herd movement had been correct, and because the income from the egg operation had allowed them to buy supplemental feed rather than selling stock at the distressed prices everyone else was taking. Not a victory exactly. It was too hard a year for anything to feel like a victory, but a year survived with the ranch intact and the margins, while thin, not broken. Burl told anyone who'd listened that Mrs. Callahan's chickens had saved the year, which Clara thought was an exaggeration, and Burl insisted it was not, and they agreed to disagree with the comfortable ease of 2 people who had by then established the particular friendship that develops between people who work alongside each other through a difficult season and come out the other side still standing. Maisie turned 5 in September and then 6 the following year, growing with the speed that children grow when you're close enough to them to forget it's happening until suddenly they're an entirely different size than you'd registered. She started learning to read that winter, the winter after the drought year, working through it with a determination that was exactly her father's, not fast, not effortless, but absolutely committed. Sitting at the kitchen table with the primer Clara had ordered from a catalog and sounding out words with a quiet intensity that meant she was in there doing the work and didn't want to be interrupted. She read her first full sentence aloud in February, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and looked up with an expression that Clara had never seen on her before. A specific, private triumph. The face of someone who has just understood that a door they didn't know existed has opened. "I read it," she said. "You did," Clara said. Maisie looked at the sentence again, as if to confirm it was still there, and still said what it had said. Then she looked at Clara. "Read me something," she said. I want to hear what it sounds like when it's longer." Clara got the book she'd been reading herself, one of the 2 she'd brought in her trunk, a collection of short stories she'd read several times and kept because they held up. And she read aloud for an hour, there at the kitchen table, while Maisie sat across from her with her chin on her hands and listened with the absorption of someone receiving something they'd been waiting for without knowing they were waiting. Rhett came in from the evening barn check and found them like that and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and Clara glanced up at him and saw something in his face that she kept with her. Not the almost smile, not the actual smile, but something quieter and more permanent than either of those. The expression of a man looking at something he didn't have a word for and wasn't trying to name. The things Clara had imagined for herself, before December, before Montana, before any of this. They had been small imaginations, she understood now. Not because she'd lacked ambition, but because she hadn't known what was possible when you put your hands on something real and held on. She'd imagined security. She'd imagined competence recognized. She'd imagined not being alone, in the functional sense of the word. She had not imagined Maisie at 5 saying mama without thinking about it, the word completely natural, reaching her without any of the deliberateness of the first time she'd said it. She had not imagined the egg ledger growing thick enough to require a second book. She had not imagined Rhett's hand turning over to hold hers in a drought year August. She had not imagined reading aloud at a kitchen table to a child who was learning what words could do. The small imaginations had been survivable. The real thing turned out to be different in kind. By the time 2 full years had passed since that December train platform, the Callahan Ranch was known in Harlan Creek as a well-run operation that had handled the drought year better than most. And Clara was known as the woman who ran the egg business and the household accounts, and had opinions about root vegetables, and attended the ladies' auxiliary first Friday of every month, and had, in the quiet, accumulating way of someone who does consistent work in a consistent place, become part of the fabric of the town. Not a figure of drama anymore. Not the woman from the train platform, or not only that, just Clara Callahan, who was organized and direct, and occasionally impatient and made good biscuits, and had a daughter who was learning to read, and a husband who didn't say much but meant everything he did say. Mrs. Colton told her, at a ladies' auxiliary meeting in the second spring, that she'd been wrong about her. She said it plainly, without excessive ceremony, because she was a woman who'd lived long enough to know that apologies delivered plainly were more respectful than apologies delivered with a lot of production. "I thought you were making the best of a bad situation," she said. "I didn't see you were building something." "Most people don't," Clara said. "At the beginning." "No," Mrs. Colton said. "They don't." She looked at Clara with the clear eyes of a woman who'd watched a lot of lives in this territory. "You're good for him," she said, "and for that child." "They're good for me," Clara said, which was true, and which she meant completely, and which was the thing she thought people missed sometimes about the story of a woman who'd been abandoned in the cold and found her footing, the assumption that it was all about what she'd overcome, what she'd endured, what she'd proven. As if the value of it was in the suffering. It wasn't. The suffering was just the door she'd walked through. What was on the other side was what mattered. The understanding she'd arrived at, in the years since December, wasn't a grand one. It wasn't the kind of thing you could put on a banner. It was smaller and more specific than that. It was this: the world will tell you what you're worth constantly, in small ways and large ones, and most of what it tells you is about the world's own limitations and not about you. Edmund Graves had looked at her on a train platform and seen a disappointment. What he'd actually seen was a woman he didn't have the imagination to understand. The two things looked the same from where he was standing, but they were entirely different facts. She had learned over 2 years on a Montana ranch that worth wasn't granted. It wasn't confirmed by someone else's recognition. It was built, slowly and imperfectly, and with a lot of scorched stew and cracked knuckles and frozen laundry and one terrible blizzard night out of every day you showed up and did the actual work of the life you were in. That was all. It wasn't more complicated than that. It was just hard enough that most people kept waiting for the confirmation instead of doing the building. What Clara had understood, somewhere between the willow bark tea at midnight and the egg ledger and the hand turned over on the table, was that she'd stopped waiting. She wasn't sure exactly when it happened. She thought it might have been gradual, but somewhere in the accumulation of fixed latches and learned stoves and stories told in the dark to a sick child, she had stopped being a woman who was surviving someone else's rejection and become a woman who was building something that was entirely her own. In the spring of the 3rd year, she planted the kitchen garden again, the turnips and parsnips and beets and herbs, and she added a row of something new, a flower, a yellow one she'd seen in a catalog and ordered on an impulse she didn't fully explain to herself. When they came up, small and bright and entirely unnecessary for any practical purpose. Maisie cut 3 of them and put them in a tin cup on the kitchen table and announced they improved the room. "They do," Clara agreed. "I think we should plant more next year," Maisie said. "More colors." "I think we should," Clara said. Rhett looked at the flowers in the tin cup on the kitchen table and then at Clara, and she looked back at him. And the look between them was easy and complete and carried in it everything that didn't need to be said again because it had already been said in the versions of things that mattered. In a sleepless night with a fever, in an account ledger opened across a table, in a hand turned over, in a child's voice saying "Mama" without thinking about it. On a morning in late April of that 3rd year, Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked out at the south side of the house. The coop, the garden coming in, the yellow flowers just beginning to push through the soil, and the mountains behind all of it, still snow-capped at the peaks, but with the lower slopes green now, genuinely green. The color you forget is possible in winter, and that arrives every spring like something you'd given up on. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in December with a green wool coat and $11, and a refusal to take money from a man who'd humiliated her, and she felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite gratitude, and was maybe just recognition. The clear-eyed acknowledgement of a distance traveled. Not the distance on a map, not the miles between Chicago and Montana, but the other kind. The kind that doesn't have a unit of measurement because what it measures is who you were and who you became. And the gap between those two things, which is where your life actually happened. She had been left to freeze. She had not frozen. She had built a kitchen garden and a poultry operation, and a household, and a marriage, and a family. Imperfectly, and with a lot of hard seasons in between, and none of it had been smooth, and none of it had been what she'd imagined, and all of it was more than she'd dared to want. Maisie came downstairs in her nightclothes, hair loose, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and appeared at Clara's elbow. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The mountains," Clara said. Maisie looked at them, serious and sleep-soft. "They're pretty this time of year," she said, with the authority of a child who has been looking at them her whole life. "They are," Clara said. "Are you happy?" Maisie asked, with the directness she'd always had and had only gotten more precise with age. Clara looked at her. She thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about, not the quick, reassuring answer, but the real one. "Yes," she said, "not always and not perfectly, but yes." Maisie seemed to find this answer entirely satisfactory, which said something good about who she was becoming. She leaned against Clara's arm and looked at the mountains, and Clara put her arm around her, and they stood at the kitchen window in the early April morning while the coffee went cold on the counter and the mountains held their snow at the peaks, and the garden below began another slow year of becoming. Rhett came in from the barn. He saw them at the window. He hung his hat. He came to the stove and poured the coffee that had gone cold and didn't comment on it and stood beside them. 3 people at a window, looking at mountains. The ordinary fact of a morning. The extraordinary fact of having found it. That was all. That was everything. The woman left to freeze in the snow had built the only thing worth building. Not a legacy, not a reputation, not a triumph over the people who'd underestimated her, but a life. A real one, with cold mornings and difficult seasons and imperfect people who showed up for each other anyway, which is the only version of a life that actually holds. Outside, the mountains stood as they always had. The land was indifferent to human stories as it had always been. But the house was warm, and the garden was coming in. And somewhere in the coop on the south side, Adelaide the hen was already announcing her opinion of the morning to anyone who would listen. And Maisie laughed at the sound. And Rhett's coffee was cold, but he drank it anyway. And Clara stood in the middle of all of it and knew, without any remaining doubt, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.